Emil Cadlick here with FantasyNation.com. I have a wonderful guest today, a pioneer, Brady Tinker, who actually got fantasy sports on the national TV airways back in the mid-1990s. So here you are, Brady Tinker. How you doing today?
It's funny, Emil, that you called today because I was just polishing off a couple of the trophies that I won from the Fantasy Sports Trade Association back in the mid-90s for doing the best fantasy baseball and fantasy football TV shows on the airwaves. Now, it would have been terrible if I hadn't won because we were the only fantasy baseball and fantasy football shows on the airwaves. But
That's good.
It was a lot of fun. That was 1996, 97, 98. I did them all the way through 2001.
Wow.
And the company that I was working for, Prime Sports, went out of business. Fox Sports, their regional, came in and took over. And so we aired the first time I was on television. I'd never been on television, and I was in 45 million homes.
45 million homes? Is this around
45 million in 1996.
In 96?
Mm-hmm. It was every Fox Sports regional in the country, which at the time I think there were 12 regionals.
Wow, I'm just stunned. I'm just stunned at that. That's incredible.
I want it on TV.
And
I want it on TV. It was what I wanted to do. I had taken a job with Prime Sports, and I went in and told them, I said, this is what I want to do. I know I'm going to be good at it. And they said, oh, great. So you went to college for radio, TV, and film. And I was like, no, I was a business marketing major. I'm good at selling. And so they sort of giggled and said, okay, well, we need someone to come sell these fantasy football and baseball shows. And if you're destined to be on TV, it was sort of like this. Yeah, right. Then, we'll give you your opportunity. And a year after I'd been there, I'd sold just under $1 million worth of sponsorships to these shows all over the country. I was the only person selling, and did a big deal with Barry Dorf at the time, who was with EA Sports, did a big deal with a clothing brand that I can't remember, and some other people, and we made some money. And one of the key members of the TV show at the time, when Fox came in, they said, we don't like that guy. So they told my boss, get rid of that guy. Do you have anyone else? And my boss was like, I got a guy who thinks he can do it. And literally they gave me a shot. First time I'd ever been on TV in my life. And they gave me a shot to 45 million homes.
So do you remember the first time you were on? Were you nervous or?
I do. I vividly remember it. And certainly I was a little nervous, but I had been around the TV facility there for now a year. They had let me practice quite a bit. They'd let me work teleprompters, and they'd put IFBs in my ear, and they had done some things to get me ready. I'd made some friends with some of the directors and the producers, so it wasn't completely out of the blue. I didn't think about 45 million homes, and luckily it didn't hit me that way. There were 3 cameras, someone running each of the 3 cameras. There was the floor director. There was a director and a producer in my ear, and those are the people that I was doing the show for. It was just 5 or 6 people. I didn't think that my parents were watching in Kansas City, which they were, or old girlfriends in LA, which they probably weren't. But I don't remember being intimidated. The thing about any of this, what you do and what everybody does now on radio and TV or podcasts or anywhere else that you're doing programming, if you study and you know what you're talking about and what you're doing, then you're a lot less nervous, just like speaking in front of a group of kids or whatever it may be. So I'm sure I was sweating, but I was very excited.
Where was this studio at?
It's still there. It's the Fox Sports Southwest Studios, which is in Irving, Texas. They're still there. They're still the home for the Dallas Mavericks, the Dallas Stars, and the Texas Rangers. That's predominantly what the regionals do now. The regionals used to do a bunch of other programming, but they really don't anymore. They mostly do pre-games and post-games for their teams, and then they do some high school sports and this and that and the other. But it was a beautiful 3-pronged studio that Prime Sports had built. Fox Sports came in and kind of gave it a facelift when they showed up in 97. And so there are 3 different studios to work out of and 1 main control room. And it's still there. They're still doing all of their stuff out of that.
That's fantastic. So let's go back a little bit when you were younger.
Sure.
When you were going to college or whatever, when you were young, were you into sports back then when you were a youth? I
was. I went to the University of Arkansas to try and play basketball, and certainly thought I was going to make it and I was going to walk on. They were a top 20 school Eddie Sutton was the coach, and I made it through 2 or 3 practices, and I still have my Razorback garb. And he looked at me and said, I can run you off a bunch of screens and you can shoot, but I don't think there's anyone here you can cover. And I said, oh, yeah, you're right about that. He said, I'm pretty sure there's not anyone on the girls' team you can cover. And I looked at him and I said, and he wasn't wrong. He wasn't wrong. And so that was it. The dream did not last very long to be an Arkansas Razorback basketball player, but I had been a high school tennis player, golfer, baseball player. So transferred back towards home to Kansas State and walked on their golf team, ended up getting a full ride. And then my senior year, quit the golf team and jumped on the tennis team with a couple of guys that I played tennis with in high school and lettered, and they gave me a full ride my senior year too. So ended up playing college sports. So yeah, sports, it had always been sports. And I think, for me, the part that resonated and has now for nearly a 25-year career was I was always as interested in how the games were played as I was the games. So when it came to doing this or having an opinion on sports or players, running backs that might do well, I always had a feel for how an offensive line was structured or the way coaches set up offenses. And so that part of that thinking came naturally to me. So, to cover the Rangers and the Mavs, which I have, or the Cowboys, which I have, and fantasy sports fit right in, it came easy to me. But it wasn't what I went to school for. It was a career change. It was I was 31 years old when I went to Prime Sports and took that sales job, and just almost 32 when I got on TV for the first time.
So do you recall who thought, let's do a TV show, or how they were?
They were doing it when I got there. I went and found a local sports icon and said, I want to get into this business. And he was very frank, and he's like, don't do it. This is a top 5 market. And he said, even in a top 5 market, there's about a dozen of us getting paid. Everybody else works in sports because it's sports, and you want to work in sports, but they will work your butt off and they won't pay you. You'll never get paid. Don't do it. But I kept coming and coming. And he's like, all right, if you're going to do it, then I'll help you as best I can. So I ended up going in. He had a 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. Sports talk show on the radio. And I ended up going in at 4 a.m. for months and helping him prepare. And this was, the internet wasn't really a thing then. And he was not even really computer literate. So most of what he got came from other radio shows and newspapers. And so I would go in and help him. And he was a content guy. He's still in there. He's terrific. And he was a content guy. And so he began to teach me. And after a while, he would have me sit in the studio and he would talk to me. He would bring me in on the show. Now, they were paying me $7 an hour. And the previous business that I had been in had me as a 6-figure guy. So my wife wasn't going to last long with me on minimum wage. So same guy introduced me to this TV station, Prime Sports, and said, hey, I don't know if there's any jobs over there, but they can probably use you. And that's how I did a year around the radio stations at minimum wage, met a bunch of really famous guys who gave me a lot of Dallas icons, if you will, who gave me a lot of help. And I was able to sort of manipulate my way into getting some credentials with the Mavs and the Rangers and the Stars shortly after that. And all of a sudden, once you've got a credential and you're getting into the locker room and you're asking questions, you're in. They didn't know who I was, so I'm getting some funny looks. My questions were a little bit different than most people's because I was more of a, from the heart, how's the team doing? How's everybody pulling together, as opposed to, boy, 4 false starts really cost you guys the game. So, it took me a while to make my way, but I never really did care what everyone else thought because I knew what I was trying to do, and that's all I really needed to do.
Wow, that's a really great story.
It's been terrific.
What a whirlwind. I can't believe 45 million people. Now, back then, can you remind me if football was bigger at that point, or they decided to do football first?
Sure. Football was bigger, but baseball was the traditional sport for fantasy sports, rotisserie and that type of thing. So I actually think, to be honest with you, the first show they did was baseball. And it was more the people, they decided to do a show. It was the group that I was working for was doing their own game. They had a room full of people taking phone calls, and their business and their business model was about getting people to play their fantasy game. And to be honest with you, I can't remember what the name of the company was, but and they came in and were owned by the group who owned the Prime Sports TV. So the Prime Sports TV people said, well, you've got this game and go ahead, make yourself a TV show, and that will give you a leg up in the industry because you'll be putting your games on television. So, but I know baseball was first, and the oddity of the whole thing was the people that were running that company weren't big sports fans and didn't know anything about fantasy sports and didn't know much more about television. So they were businessmen, and it could have been goats or refrigerators or whatever. It just happened to be fantasy sports. And it just happened to be they had basically a free entree into the world of TV, and they took it. So in the end, to be honest with you, that was our downfall, that we had people didn't understand the industry, who didn't understand what fantasy sports was, the type of people who were playing it, what it was going to evolve in. They didn't really have a vision. They really felt like this fantasy game that they were running, where people were calling in and paying $2 to make a trade, was how they were going to make a lot of money. And the truth is, I raised, the first 2 years that I was on TV, I was still selling the TV shows, and I raised $3 million in sponsorships for our TV shows in just under 2 years. And yet the people that I was working for still felt like these fantasy games and the phone calls and the trades made that way were how we were going to make our money. And at that point, I didn't care. I was on television. I was selling more than anyone else. They were paying me, 7, 8, 9, 10% on commissions, and I was making lots of money, and I was on television. I was happy as I could be.
That's fantastic. Well, I guess it probably helped when Fox took it over in '97 if Prime wasn't.
It did. It gave us, first of all, the right people came in to teach me television. It was the biggest break in the world for me. Because they brought in a producer that was recommended to them from Atlanta, who was out of this world. He'd done some Olympics and he'd done some U.S. Opens, and he had done some stuff for CBS. He'd done Golf Channel. And so this guy came in and, just took me under his wing, molded me, smacked me in the face, yelled at me, when my hands were up and hands down, and, wrists on the desk. And, if I would make same mistakes over and over again, he would throw his headset down. He would burst in through the door. And he would tear me up. And boy, it taught me a lot. It really did. It taught me a lot.
It was live, in your head?
No, it wasn't live. It was it was live to tape.
Okay.
None of us that were doing the shows, you remember, I'll tell you some names of people who ended up doing these shows with me. So Bob Golick, not Mike Golick, but Bob Golick was on the football show with us for 2 years. James Lofton did the football show with me for 3 years. Terry Bradshaw actually sat in, I think, 2 or 3 years in a row and did our opening show, did our big 1 hour kickoff show, because he lives, in Fort Worth. Yeah, he still has a ranch in Fort Worth. And we had some connections. The Fox guys had some connections with him. He came in and did our opening 1 hour show, I think 3 years in a row. And then for baseball, after we'd really gotten our feet underneath us with football, and these guys were working out, these players were working out, they called me and said, well, who do you want to get for baseball? We don't really have any money. And I said, well, and I just started thinking about personalities that I had met, in the last few years along the way. And I'd met Goose Gossage, and I had not met John Kruk, but I thought he was funny and unusual. And those are the two people that we went after. And we ended up getting both Goose Gossage and John Kruk. Kruk did 2 years worth of shows. I found him in West Virginia. I called and called and called and got a hold of his mom in West Virginia. And I got him on the phone and I said, we'd like to fly you to Dallas and try you out for a television show that will be about a 4 or 5 month deal. So he came to town. And he sat down with me and my boss, and he said, I'll take the job. He said, I like Brady. I'll take the job. You'll have to teach me television. And then he negotiated the ability for us to move him from West Virginia to Dallas when we offered him whatever we offered him. And he said, well, how much are you going to spend getting me here in hotels and rental cars? And we sort of figured it all out. And he said, if you'll add all that to my pay, I'll move to Dallas. And we were like, excuse us? And he literally moved within a half mile of the TV studio and went over to join the local country club because he was a big golfer. And he and I walked in the pro shop, and the guy, when we were done, the guy said, Kruk, you can come anytime. You're an official member. You don't have to pay us anything. Sign autographs and be nice to the people. And so he would come in and do the TV show. We'd do the TV show. We'd leave and go play golf. And after it was over, we'd go watch Jerry Springer. And we did that. Kruk is a piece of work. And now, when he comes to town for MLB, I always will call him and hit him up and say, the least you owe me is breakfast, because he's making upwards of $1 million a year on the MLB network and he's terrific at it. He's just terrific at it. And
Wow.
Goose Gossage and I are still real close, and those guys did baseball shows with me for a long time.
That's a great story. Terry Bradshaw, tell us about him. What was he like off air? Was he as goofy as we?
He was fantastic. He was regular as hell, asked questions, engaged in conversation while we were in the green room. I do specifically remember the first show that he did. He didn't prepare very much. I think he came in and he's Terry, and we all were like, it's Terry. He's great, and he's going to host the show. So Bob Golick was here, and James Lofton was here, and I was at the end of the table, and they were basically saying, Bob Golick played for the Cleveland Browns, and James Lofton, I don't think he was in the Hall of Fame yet, but Buffalo Bills and Green Bay Packers. And then Terry says, at the end of the table is a guy who never played for any team, probably past Pee Wee football, but he knows a lot about fantasy sports. So he's here, welcome in Brady Tinker. And that was fine. I expected a little backhand, right, from the boys who played the game. And so we got about 8 minutes into the first segment, and Terry throws up his hands and he says, stop, cut, stop. And I was like, and he says, he brings the producer, comes out, and he says, this guy at the end of the table knows everything about everything. And he's like, it's sort of pissing me off. I didn't study. And he was half serious, half not. But he was basically saying, I'm throwing out things, and he knows things that I should know, right, about running backs and formations and coaching changes, and and he hadn't studied. And so he wasn't serious, but he was serious. And so he basically made the director give him a few things and allow him to study a little bit so that he was sharp on a few of the things that he was going to be asked to talk about. But it was funny because he pointed at me. He's like, and he couldn't even remember my name. He goes, this guy at the end of the table, he says, oh my God, he knows everything there is to know about everything. I'm supposed to be the one who knows everything about everything. But I remember that vividly. But the truth is he was fantastic. He was great to everyone. He put up with everyone. He was kind. He was on time. He was fun. He did it 3 years in a row. I don't know that we even paid him anything. All I can tell you is, my interaction with him in those 3 years was nothing but wonderful. She was regular. He was just kind of like you'd expect. He was goofy, fun, Terry. He did not big time anybody for a minute.
So do you think maybe he did it because he wanted to develop his ability to do TV, or?
I never asked him. I think, to be honest with you, that the people at Prime Sports that owned this station that I was on, there was somebody there that knew him pretty well and asked him to do it. And when he got there and Bob Golick was there and James Lofton were there, it gave it some credibility. Certainly I didn't help, but those two guys gave it some credibility. And he was like, whatever. So I'm sure they did pay him. Saying that they didn't pay him would be silly. But I know they didn't pay him a lot. But yeah, I think, as long as there were former NFL guys there that he respected that were doing it, what the hell? It was only an hour from his house.
Yeah, that's pretty good. Well, obviously he's made an incredible career as a whatever you want to call him, analyst or funny guy.
He's wonderful. Yeah, he's wonderful. My wife absolutely loves him. Whenever there's pictures of him here in my office of the four of us, and it was funny because my wife for the longest time did not notice them. One day she said to me, it wasn't that long ago, she said, God, I love Terry Bradshaw. She said, even the movies that he did, I just love his personality, and I think he's so great. And I'm like, well, I did, TV stuff with him for 2 or 3 years. There's pictures of us up in my office. She's like, no, there's not. And literally, she came running up to my office, and she's like, there he is right there. And I said, I'm sorry, babe. I didn't know it was important to you. I would have brought it up sooner.
Well, they did a special on him on ESPN or whatever. I forget what they call the thing, 30-30 or something recently. And I'd heard, somewhere before, he had a lot of issues in his life, especially depression.
Yeah.
And so he went through a lot of stuff. He went through a lot
of
stuff.
He did. I know he did. I think, to be honest with you, when he was coming to see us, at least for one of those shows, he and his wife were separated, but he had, I never went out, but he had a big ranch and farm out in Fort Worth somewhere. And I remember sort of vividly that he was a little off one of the times that he came, and basically confided in us that he was living in the barn or living in, in the outhouse, and she was in the main house, and they were going through some stuff, and it greatly upset him. I mean, he wasn't petulant mad. He was hurt. He was upset. Yeah.
Difficult times. It's and I didn't watch that show that closely, but obviously there was a lot of issues of his maturity and, well, not maturity, but I mean, a lot of his early career, he was benched a certain amount of time before
Yeah.
he achieved, winning 4 Super Bowls. And then when he did that, he got hurt and out he went. So he's had an
Yeah.
interesting life. So it's fascinating that you
He
work
has indeed. I think if there's anything that I like about him, it's just that he's always just the same guy. Every time I've come across him, when I see TV and he's goofing and he's having fun, and sometimes he's great, sometimes he's not so great. And if he's not great, he sort of makes fun of himself. And I think to myself, that's exactly the guy that I met. You know what I mean? And I felt that way about Kruk too. Kruk was all the time on the air, off the air, whatever else. He was the same guy. That's John Kruk. Goofy, fun. A little glib, a little blue sometimes, but both those guys were extremely regular and always the same guy, which I admired in both of them.
Wow. So some of the, as you started the show, did you get some fantasy sports advertisers for the show?
Sure we did. Yeah, that's how, to be honest with you, the company that I was with, the Prime Sports Company, when I got there, was a couple of companies, and we had maybe 60 or 70 people working at that company. When I left after the 2001 last show that we did, I was the only employee. And that was the case because I was able to continue to raise money for these TV shows. And so the owners of the company were like, "You're making us money." And he paid me a lot more money. He raised my pay a lot because I was bringing in $1 million worth of sponsorships a year. And at the first, until 2001, Fox wasn't charging us. Fox and Fox Sports Southwest were not charging us anything for the airtime. And so they gave us that 6-year contract and said, we're going to need the content anyway. So if there's something about the show we like or we don't like, we reserve the right to tell you. But overall, you get free airtime and free advertising, and I was then allowed to sell advertising into our show, and we kept 100% of the proceeds. So I was literally the last employee, and EA Sports left me, and the clothing manufacturer left me after the 2001 season and basically said, we're going to ESPN. They're going to do some of what you did for us, only bigger, as you can imagine, right? It's ESPN. And so that was finally the end of me doing that there. But yeah, I went from one of 62 employees to the only employee who sold these 2 TV shows and then starred in them. And it was odd. It was sad because that little company, I remember in maybe year 3 or 4, we got offered, someone came in to buy the fantasy aspect of it and the rights to the TV shows, and offered, from what I understand, like $23, $24, $25 million. And the young guys that were working for Prime Sports at the time held out, wanted another $5 million or whatever, and the deal went away. And we ended up 2 years later out of business.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah,
that's a tough one.
Yeah,
wow, that is a tough.
It was too bad. Yeah,
that's very bad. When was the show on, once a week, or how did that work?
The show was on once a week. Fox, again, needing the content, would re-air it. So we would generally, as I remember, we would tape on a Thursday afternoon, and they would air it on Saturday morning at 10, I think, and then they would re-air it Saturday night, and they would re-air it sometimes Sunday. So we got 3 airings leading into the following week. Most of the show prep for all of the baseball, at least, was that we'd get you ready for games starting next Monday. And we were really, there were some things that weren't perfect about the show because we were pushing our game. So we weren't worried about, the rest of the universe. We were pushing our game and our schedule, which I didn't really understand. And, it was hard. I remember even with the producers and the people who owned the company for a while, them saying, well, we need more Jerry Rice, we need more Emmitt Smith. And I would say, if you really want to drive fantasy sports customers and get people to watch this show, they're putting Emmitt Smith in. What they need to know is, that 14th running back and the 15th running back and the 16th running back and the quarterback that might have a good week because he's going up against the 28th ranked defense. I mean, those are the people that we should be talking about. I realize that seeing Jerry Rice do something great on screen is maybe exciting and turns people on more. But I also remember that, and it's not different now, the NFL allowed us, I think, 90 seconds worth of video that we could use from the week before. 90 seconds. And then anything after that we wanted to use was $1,500 a minute.
Ooh. How long was
And
the
to be
show?
honest with you, it was a 30-minute show. There was 22 and a half minutes of content and 7.5 minutes of commercials. And so my boss came to me and said, what do we do about this? And I said, it's all right. We'll get enough out in 90 seconds. We can show, a 7-second clip of somebody making a great catch and a sack and a fumble and a strip and whatever else. We can get enough out of our 90 seconds. And then that's when I went to EA Sports and I flew to San Francisco and I said, I have an idea. We have a need on our show because NFL content is too expensive for us. So we're going to take your Madden game and we're going to have, at the time, when we first started it, they sent us whatever it was, an Xbox or whatever it was, and they sent us several Madden games. And we had young kids in our studio sit down and play the game, and I would write a script out for them of what I wanted to happen. So I would say, I need Jerome Bettis running over a small Kansas City defensive line, boom, 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 in the Madden game. And then they would do it for me. They would sit there 3 or 4 hours and get me all that I wanted, right? And they would hit record in the bowels of the studio. And so it would pull right off of Madden, go to record, and we would use it during the show. So 1 minute I'm showing real NFL footage, and the next minute I'm showing Madden's NFL 97, and Jerome Bettis is showing you what he's going to do to the Kansas City Chiefs. He's the number 1 running back of the week. And they absolutely flipped. They loved it. They loved it. And that's how I kept them for, I think, 4 or 5 years until ESPN came to them and said, well, we're going to do stuff like he's doing only 100 times better. Yeah. And they showed it to them. And it involved augmented reality, as you've seen, all that stuff that they've done for ESPN for years. But I was the one that got that started with them.
That's
and we made we did a lot of business. And it was a good idea. It really was. It was a good idea.
That's a clever marketing ploy. It's a brilliant marketing ploy.
I've been able to sell forever.
Pardon?
I said I've been able to sell forever, which has helped. Anytime someone didn't want me to do a radio or TV show, I would raise enough money and they'd say, okay, you give us a lot of that money and you can go do your radio and TV show. So,
wow.
Yeah.
So the contract ended or is about to end and ESPN got
yes,
they stole the stuff from you.
ESPN took a couple of my sponsors because they were getting bigger and bigger, and they were finally getting into the fantasy sports world as well. You remember the resistance to, the sports world and the NFL and the players associations through the years early on resisted and pushed back against fantasy sports. It wasn't tradition. And as a matter of fact, I went in and made deals with the NFL Players Association and the MLB Players Association, spent tons of time in D.C. and in New York with both those organizations, pushing them to adopt us. And that's when we changed the names of the show, right? The first year, whatever, I don't even remember what it's called, but the second year and the third year and the fourth year through 2001, all those shows were called MLB Players, and that was the Players Association, and NFL Players. And I went to both of their home offices and negotiated with them for 6 months, both of them, and said, if you're looking at this wrong, everyone knows who Jerry Rice is, but no one knows who's the fourth wide receiver is. No one knows who's the offensive line is. Television's not that good, and we're going to introduce people to more of the NFL Players Association's players. That's good for you, not bad. And we did the same thing with the MLBPA, and they all finally acquiesced. And to be honest with you, I got the NFL Players Association for the last 3 years that I was on TV. They had their own sponsors. They had 6 or 7 sponsors. And I got in a closed-door meeting and said, you have these sponsors. What are you giving them? And they said, well, the MLB Players Awards, and we do a dinner, and they get to come to some training camp stuff and whatever. And I said, why don't you give them a TV show? And they were like, what do you mean? I said, I'm already doing a TV show. So raise the cost of that clothing sponsor and that car dealer sponsorship by $100,000 a year, give it to me, and I'll put them in the TV show, and now it's your TV show. We'll use all your logos. We'll use all your marks. Remember, the MLB Players Association was relatively new, it was in its infancy in those middle 90s. Oh. Those awards and stuff that they do they're so big now, they did in a tent. The first one I ever went to was in a tent at Disney World. It was. Derek Jeter and a bunch of names, and it was in a tent in Disney World, and there was not more than 100 people there.
So go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. No, I made.
You actually went to MLB, BAM or whatever, and NFL players,
Yep.
sat down with them, and you actually directed them into the future.
I did. I did. I didn't know it at the time. Everything selfishly, Emil, was about keeping me on TV.
Sure.
And it was, it was about, I couldn't get enough. I loved it. It was what I wanted to do. And I didn't know if anyone was watching, I mean, there was a lot of people that we were talking to, but I didn't know who was watching. I wasn't, my families would tell me they saw me and, whatever, and that I was doing good. But that was what I wanted to do. Once I got started, that was my career. It didn't need to be fantasy sports. It just needed to be sports. And I just wanted to keep on doing it. And I felt like I was getting better. I was getting lots of reps, if you will. I remember the first year I went in, there was a guy named Don McGuire who had worked at CBS, and he'd worked, would later work at the Golf Channel, and he worked Olympics, and he was a big producer and a big player. And he happened to be in our offices the first year when I was at Prime Sports. And so when I got on TV, I went in and I said, I developed a relationship with him, and I said, I would like it if you would teach me and if you would tell me what I'm doing wrong. And so I'm going to come in here once a week whenever you're here, if you don't mind, and you tell me how I'm doing. And I remember he said, fine, you got it. So I remember the first week I went in, maybe a couple of weeks later, and I said, so how am I doing? And he goes, well, you're terrible, but don't worry about it because no one's watching. And I vividly remember that. And his point was, I think that was a reflection more of not the network that was doing well, but the fact that in his mind, nobody cared about fantasy sports. I think that was his point, was you're doing a fantasy baseball show and friggin' no one plays fantasy baseball, I think was his point. And he wasn't, he was direct, and I asked him to be direct, and he was like, just keep going. You're getting reps. You're lucky because you're getting them with a director and a producer that are going to mold you and teach you. And you're on, big time network now, but no one's watching that show, was his point. As your ratings aren't very good, no one's watching. So don't be nervous, I think is what he was trying to say, was you're sucking, but maybe you'll get better, and just keep your head down and keep doing what you're doing.
Wow. Not a very motivational speaker there.
No, that wasn't his style. He'd always been in charge. He'd been in charge at CBS at a very high level, CBS Sports, and ended up being at a high level at the Golf Channel as the Golf Channel was in its infancy and growing. And he was a player, and people respected what he had to say, and I took it that way. I took it as, I'm lucky to be having this conversation. I don't care what he says to me.
Well,
and
I think a little wrong. I mean, perhaps the show wasn't getting the reviews that, it was the mid and late 90s. Obviously, fantasy was still growing rapidly, but I think it was a bit wrong about fantasy, and I think that's parallels a lot of things that we saw with the NFL, et cetera, that they just hated They just initially, first off, they thought it was gambling, in the early mid-90s. Right. But I think they just never got it, and it took a little longer for them to actually figure it out, mid-2000s.
No doubt. No doubt. And to be honest with you, my TV and radio career and the podcast that I'm doing now have all turned out great, but I can certainly see that I could see me sitting here now 25 years into the fantasy sports business. But at the time, I didn't know enough about it either. For me, it was sports television, and that's what I wanted to do. But Greg Ambrosius and I have become very good friends, and I've done what little I can do to help his businesses through the years, making appearances for him in Vegas and being a small part of what they've grown. But I wasn't smart enough to see that industry really was going to make it. Especially once the internet came out, the whole world changed. Right? It wasn't. Because we were all perceived as sad losers, right? Who were calling each other and reading newspapers and, you're calling your best friend in St. Louis to see if Marshall Faulk's going to play this week and, all of that kind of stuff. So, and we were spending way too much time on it, which people still think. And, we must be sad couch potato type people, and that was never going to work. But I've thought about that recently of what would my life have been like if I'd have spent 25 years in this industry. No regrets, but I certainly, at sometimes when I'm with Greg and all the stuff that he's done, there are times when I think, I wish I would have been arm in arm with him and having done this for the last 25 years, also because of the friendship that we have.
No, that's very nice. That's very good. So tell me about your podcast you're doing now.
Well, I still, I cover the Rangers, the Mavs, and the Stars. I do a radio show on ESPN during the football season, and I do a radio show right now during the basketball season, and those are both with players. So I get Cowboys players 10, 12 times a year on their on Tuesday, which is generally their off day, to come do a live show that we air on ESPN radio locally. And then I do the same thing for the Mavs. JJ Barea and I are doing a show currently, because this is the first time in the 4 or 5 years the Mavs looks like are going to make the playoffs. And Luka obviously has everybody all fired up. So, but the podcast is Cowboys based. That once you got into TV and radio here, if you were going to play the hits, as it were, in this industry, then you were going to cover the Cowboys a lot. And so that's the organization that I got the closest to. I have really good relationships with Jerry and Steven and Will McClay and the people that are tied in there. And so through the years, in really getting to be friends with Romo and the Randy Whites of the world and Tony Dorsett's of the world and different people throughout the years, the relationships have been the most important. So I decided, sort of as a side project, to start a podcast called A Cowboy Life. And it is one story by one current or former player about their careers. And in the end, 48 of these later, hardly any of the stories have been on the field stories. Most of them have been touching things of, I would have never been here, but my mom sacrificed, all this until I was 16, and then I ended up at Michigan playing football or whatever. That, those are the stories that have come out. And so it's been tons of fun. It's called A Cowboy Life. And it's everywhere, on all podcast platforms, iTunes and what have you.
Okay.
Not Cowboys, but a Cowboy Life. The plan is, with investors that I have, is to eventually do a Patriot Life, Steeler Life, and a Packer Life, and a Raider Life, and probably 15 of the most iconic organizations. So we're just getting started, but I'm proud of it. And if people are into storytelling, it's about Dallas Cowboys, but it's not completely over-the-top Cowboy-centric in that, I'm just loving on the Cowboys. These are just genuine stories about people.
Yeah, true life stories. Those are really great stuff. You mentioned Tony Romo, and you said you know him a little bit. Did you ever think this guy could go on a network and become instant the best analyst guy that you have?
Absolutely. I met him his rookie year. Somebody came up to me in the locker room and said, you need to go meet that guy. And I looked over and I said, I don't even know who that is. And they said, well, he's an undrafted rookie out of Illinois somewhere, whatever, but he's single and he's a really good golfer. And you're a good golfer. And I'm like, all right, I'll do that. So I walked across the room, and he and I literally played golf 2 days after that and started to develop a relationship playing golf for the most part. I also played in a lot of pickup basketball games and stuff like that with him, which he's one of the most competitive people that I've ever met. But and he's one of the best athletes I've ever been around. But as he and I got close, I was doing a live TV show now on a local network, and it was a nightly, Monday through Friday, 2-hour live TV show where we took calls. So as he progressed and was still on the team, I started having him on my show. And people would, call me and say, why are you having this guy and he doesn't even play? And I'm like, well, he is a Dallas Cowboy quarterback. He's very good looking. He's very well spoken. And for whatever reason, he's willing to say anything, which at the time, I didn't think was necessarily his best idea. I wanted to protect him. I wanted him to have his shot and not to overstep his bounds or say something about a player or a teammate or something. So I remember vividly there being times when I would say, oh, this happened this week. I won't ask you about that. And he would say, ask me. I need to learn how to answer those questions. I need to learn how to answer them without answering them. Or I need to, learn how to be able to say something without pissing everyone off. I need the practice. Ask me. And he was on my show regularly on TV with me for the first 3 years until until Quincy Carter pushed himself out of the league and Tony got his chance. So yes, there was no doubt in my mind that he was going to be very good. Did I know he was going to be this good? And that, by the time he got there, yes, because I knew he was a savant. I knew he was Yoda. I knew, his gifts weren't physical. He was a little heavy-legged. He was a little slow. But the dropping of the hip and all of those things, all those plays that he made and his ability to always look down the field, for me, made him special. And that was what he knew about the game. So to say that I knew he was going to make $17 million a year, absolutely not. But did I think that he would get a chance, and was I surprised? Am I surprised that he's this good? No. And he's not my only guy, to be honest with you. SEC Network has Marcus Spears. And Marcus Spears did 4 years worth of radio shows with me and was on my TV shows, and I trained him. And I told you about Crux. So I have some former students that are making lots more money than I am in the industry at this point. So, but no, to answer your question, nope, I'm not surprised that he's coming close to making a cut on the tour. And nope, I'm not surprised that he's doing really good at TV. He's extraordinarily competitive, and he is a Yoda as far as understanding the game of football.
Well, it's such a beautiful thing to watch this guy as analysis. I just was so happy. And I was kind of sad for him because he's gone from a free agent. He got on the team. He didn't quite get where he wanted to be. Then he started getting injured, and then he lost his position. And when he came out and gave Dak Prescott, he says, "It's your team. I'm done." That was really touching, that he, knowing his competitiveness, that had the forthright to, instead of keep digging, to say, "Hey, I'm done and it's yours."
Well, there was plenty of behind the scenes stuff there that went on that people don't know.
Tell us about it.
Well, I'm not going to tell you about it, but I'll allude to the fact that the competitive Tony Romo did not give up his position lightly to Dak. He came back, and really, in my opinion, it's a mistake that the Cowboys are still paying for right to this moment, to the conversation about how much money Dak is going to make. Because the truth is, as you know, Tony got hurt right there in the preseason game against Seattle in whatever year that was, 16, I think. And they had drafted Dak in the 4th round, and Dak had never taken a snap under center. So the plan here was for Dak to watch Tony for at least a couple of years, and maybe he would make it. And all of a sudden, Tony's hurt, the backup's hurt, and Dak is thrust into play. And as we all remember, I think he won his first 9 games. And in my opinion, Jerry made a big mistake. And Tony, after week 9 or 10, was ready. And not only was he ready, but all of my moles inside the facility were saying he's by far the best quarterback of the two as we stand here in week 10. And they were most certainly going to the playoffs, and they most certainly were healthy that year and had a lot going on that was really good. And they should have put him back in. And if they would have put him back in, who knows how far they would have gone that year. They ended up losing that year in the 2nd round, I think, to Green Bay. But Dak was not ready for playoffs, and he was not ready for the adjustments that a quarterback needed to make, getting them in and out of bad plays, right? Changing the formations, moving them from side to side. And it wasn't his fault. What he'd done had been a minor friggin' miracle. And that was the part that I didn't understand. We all knew it. We all knew that this was timing based and everything was going too good. It couldn't keep going this good. It was going too good. And he should have put Tony back in. He should have let Dak have the rest of that year and the next year, under Tony. And then, his clock would have started later. We wouldn't be in a situation at the end of his rookie contract where you're thinking about paying him $38 million a year. So, and, it's funny because this is a tough group, this Dallas fan base. 3 Super Bowls with Aikman and 2 Super Bowls and 5 appearances with Roger and that group. And so now if you're not either one of those guys, then you ain't worth a damn. And so half of this town loves Romo for everything he did and all the injuries that he played through, and half of this town still thinks it was a big damn waste of time. And really? They're already there. Yeah, and they're already there with Dak. They're already, pointing and saying, mediocre. How are you going to pay him all that money? And what people don't understand is it doesn't have anything to do with our life or what we know to be a fair amount of money for, a fair job. Jerry's team is worth $5.9 billion. The TV deals alone, Dak Prescott is doing what he should be doing. With the collective bargaining agreement about to be done, I'd be trying to get all my money too. I absolutely would. Well, and especially in this league where he's already given 4 years, right? He's already given 4 years of his body, right? He's taken a beating for 4 years already, running around and throwing those big thighs in front of people. And, he wants some of this money to pay for those first 4 years. And nobody in the world gets paid like that, right? You don't get paid for what you did. You get paid for what you're going to do. But I think in the NFL, it is a little different, especially with quarterbacks and running backs, in that, if you get a free 4 years out of Dak Prescott, which they essentially did, right? Free 4 years, playoffs in 2 of the years, a extraordinarily high winning mark, then he needs some of that money, and he wants some of that money because he knows he probably won't play more than another 4 or 5 years. The league says you don't last 10 years.
Well,
but
it is a
that was a
marketplace.
long
It's a marketplace, and he's going to get what he deserves, whether you think it's an insane amount of money. And what if
Absolutely.
they don't? If they don't, well, I guess they could do other things. I don't understand all that, but you don't have somebody to bring in, so you're going to lose time developing a new guy. So you're really in a position where you're more apt to give a lot of money and hopefully try and get to some Super Bowls in the next 3 or 4 or 5 years. And if you don't, you got to start all over, and then what are the fans going to say? So I think,
I don't know. I mean, I think people look and say, well, he ain't Aaron Rodgers and he ain't Pat Mahomes. Well, no shit, and who is? Hardly anybody is, but he's loved in that locker room. He is as grown up a 24, 25-year-old as I've ever met.
Wow.
They follow him in that locker room like crazy. And I don't predict that he's necessarily going to be, Favre in the end. But if anybody has a chance to continue to grow and get better, this kid does. And based on the market and what the NFL is and what the Cowboys are, he's going to get his $35 million a year, and people need to get used to it.
Well, there is team chemistry and there's leadership that's part of being a leader and typically a quarterback because they hold the ball, they hand the ball every play, offensive play.
Right.
Well, that's a great story. Wow. This has been great stuff. You have anything else we missed that you'd like to throw in?
No, I don't think so. I appreciate you letting me push the podcast. I'm proud of it, and I would love listeners who know me or who used to know me to listen and to give me some feedback because we're working hard at this, and it's my passion project, but I would like to do it for 10 or 12 teams, and I'd like this to be something big and special. So if people will give it some time, if you're a podcast listener and you listen to This American Life or anything like that, that's really who we borrowed from is Ira Glass and This American Life, who takes these interviews and then cuts them up and adds music to them and moves them along. And when an interview tends to break down a little bit, but you go, sort of from this era to this era, I take it to that next era, right? With information that I know and by talking people through it. So it's called A Cowboy Life, and it's not an ode or big pat on the back of the Dallas Cowboys. It's stories of men who play the game that we all like watching, and most of the stories really are about the people, not about the organization.
Oh, that sounds like I'm going to have to listen to it. I like that. Sunday nights I listen to That American Life, and there's some fantastic stories.
Sure, terrific. Ira Glass is a genius, and I have stolen from him as much as I absolutely can on how to tell a story and how to put it together and how to build it, and hopefully we're getting better and better. But I had a chance to meet him at South by Southwest some years ago and talk to him for 4 or 5 minutes, and he was like, you can do this. And he gave me a few tips. He's like, there's 7 ways to make money, and these are the things that you do. And, he's very forthcoming, and he's done great. He made himself rich. So,
wow, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Maybe I can talk to him. Ha, just kidding.
Yeah.
Well, this has been an incredible story. I I've forgotten most of it because I'm old. But this is what a great career, and I know it's interesting, about the span. You'd love to have done it more, but what a great ride. And you really got to be thankful for what you got. And you got 2 trophies.
Got 2 trophies. These are big time. These are all solid. No. I remember Ambrosius handing me those trophies because he at the time was running or was the chair, I guess, for the Fantasy Trade Association.
Yeah, he's probably the president at the time.
Yeah, well, and he had, if you remember, he was on the show with me, the football show with me for a year. I don't know if you remember that. But that was how he and I got to be friends. Yeah, was we couldn't afford talent that first year, so they were looking for people who were writers, and he was doing a lot of writing, right, with that magazine that he was publishing, right, that first company that he worked for. So they called him, they flew him in from Wisconsin once a week that first year to do whatever 30 shows or so. So that is how he and I met.
Wow, that is fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm still waiting to interview him. He's got to get done with his baseball before we can do an interview. So that's going to be a fun one too. I'm
looking forward to seeing him next week in Vegas if there are still flights flying out there. Our industry is going to take a hit there, I'm afraid.
Yeah, that's not going to help. I don't want to think about that.
No, me neither.
Well, thank you so much. Congratulations. You're truly a pioneer of fantasy sports, and I really appreciate the time.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Still playing Fanex and stuff like that too.
Are you in Fanex? I
am.
I was
I've
in
been
it for years. I think you came in after I did.
I think I did, yeah, and I haven't said no yet. I think I'm 13 or 14 years in, something like that, and I won this. Yeah, I won this year. So yeah, anybody in our industry, just go ahead and I didn't get too many phone calls or attaboys. I think since I'm not in the industry anymore, they're not digging that I won. So
I see. That's funny. I actually in '98 I was in Fanex for a long time, but in '98 they wanted to expand Fanex to, instead of one analysis draft, slow draft, they wanted two,
yeah.
And they all said, well, we don't want to do two. It's too many drafts to be in two.
Right.
So they said, well, let's do a mock draft. And they said, no, that's just silly. I mean, you can't. It's not real. I said, well, let's do this. Let's do a draft, and then we'll have Terry Cannon pick each buddy's best lineup on Tuesday morning, and we'll have no free agencies. And then nobody, you have to manage it. You don't have to manage it. They go, all right, we'll give it a shot. We'll call it the Fantasy Analysis Draft. That started in '98, and that started Fantasy Best Ball. Long time ago, 22 years ago.
We're still doing it because Fanex is doing 3 different drafts, right? We do an auction that's a slow-moving auction, and then we do the regular draft, and then we do the analysis draft that you started, apparently. We do that early in the season. We still do all 3.
That's incredible. Do you guys have a website?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know if there's a website or not. I just go to,
Is it still on
the
My
place
Fantasy
where
League?
it stores it. Yeah, it is.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, fantastic. Thank you so much. And
yeah, my pleasure.
I will get this set up and send you a link.
Good. I look forward to it. Thanks for asking me.
My pleasure.